Anybody got something they've been dying to say and haven't had a chance to say? Yes, please.
Just going to say, as I was rereading the scriptures, I haven't gotten to read all the book yet. I'm in the midst of reading too many books, I guess, at this time. But anyway, in rereading those scriptures, I couldn't help but be reminded of the confirmation class I had one year. 1 week at confirmation, we read, this was all during Advent, but 1 week during a confirmation, we read the Christmas story from Jesus' birth story in Matthew. The next week, we read it from the book of Mark. When we finished reading it in the book of Mark, in the book of Luke, not Mark, Luke, Matthew, and then Luke. When we finished reading it, the youngest member of the class, who was a 5th grader, usually confirmation was taught to 7th and 8th graders, but because her sister was an 8th grader and mom had to travel between 25 and 30 miles one way to get these girls to this church out in rural Nebraska, you take the class in pairs with your siblings. The 5th grader speaks up and says, "Pastor, that's not what it says in Matthew." And I said, "No, it's not, is it?" So we spent the rest of that class and actually the next class outlining the birth stories from the two and kind of melded them together, making note with different colored markers on the board, on the big notepad, the differences and when they conflicted. And when we got all done, then we had a big discussion about how two people can see something and remember it or see it in completely different ways. But it's not always, that doesn't mean one of them is wrong. It just means that we're different people, we come from different viewpoints. And as I would read the two and again for this, I was remembering those kids, their curiosity, none of them doubted the stories. None of them said, well, if they can't agree, then this didn't happen. But it led them then for the rest of the class to be a little bit more questioning. And so we had questioned a lot. And it was the 5th grader most of the time who had those questions. Very, very bright young lady.
Yeah, sound like. Yeah. Other comments? How about you, Faith? You've been mighty quiet, dear.
I missed last week, so I feel like I've come off the thread of the conversation. But I'm just trying to soak it in. I think I've shared. I didn't come from a family that really were church people and didn't get a lot of this education. I was confirmed, but just didn't get a lot of this education growing up. So yeah, it is. It's interesting. I'm trying to just absorb it, trying to be a sponge. I just don't have a lot to share right now.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all. Thanks.
One thing I'd like to suggest while we wait for the next comment, I find this book, Introducing the New Testament. It's written by a guy named Mark Allen Powell. Is that reversed on your screen, or does it present it rightly?
Yep,
That's right.
Yeah, I recommended this to you in my text from Tex several weeks ago, but it's the best single source I know for introducing a person to the New Testament. And it's the chapters are only about 20 pages, so it's not one of these go on forever texts, you know. And it's called a historical, literary, and theological survey. And every time I preach on a given book, I always go here every week. I go to I just use it constantly. It's not, he doesn't have one point of view, but reports different scholarly points of view. And I just find it excellent. He'll do for example, he reports in here that 90% of the material in John does not appear in the other three gospels. And then he gives you lists. He'll, let me see if I can find you something very quickly. He has these little, what do you call these little squares that they put in books now? You know, they'll put a little, like here's the one, material not found in, what does it say? Not found in John's gospel. And he's got another one of those where he shows you material found in John, not found in others, you know. In other words, these helpful little places in the text that just give you, let me show you one. Here's one, some stories. Let me get to where I can see it. Yeah, some stories, what does it say, about Jesus unique to John's gospel. So that'll show you, you know, in just one list, you've got it there in a very handy way to look at. Let me show you another thing I find. He does a section on the history of the book to the extent that we know it. He does a nice section on major themes in the Gospel of John. And he uses artwork. I love this thing, the Salvador Dali's wonderful painting that I'm sure you've seen, very much influenced by the Gospel of John. And I love that picture. I would love to have a painting of that was more than the kind of things I typically find myself getting, you know, like in a book, there it is, or maybe it's on printed on some piece of pasteboard or something that somehow just never quite makes it, but it's wonderful. And like loving Jesus and abiding in Christ, he lays that out in some ways that are really very helpful. So
Tex, I now have a question.
Yeah, please.
I have a question. So what would Mr. Powell or you, what do you say to the idea that as these gospels have been handed down through the years, they have been shaped and edited by and revised by the powers that be?
Yeah. You mean powers in the negative sense?
Well, power, yeah. Well, kings, rulers, people who shaped what they wanted the people to hear.
Okay. One of the, let me say two or three things about that. The New Testament did not finally come together until the 4th century, as you perhaps know. So it was in process for a long time. And it was put together largely once the church was recognized by Constantine in the 4th century as the official religion of the empire. And I think that's one of the real tragedies in the life of the church that happened. I wish the church had maintained an independent life. At the same time, one of the things that we do have is that the early church tradition has some wonderful, wonderful people in it, like Origen and others, and the theologians. I love the Cappadocian fathers who come out of what's now Turkey, you know, the whole Eastern faith. One of the theologians that I love so much, as you know, is David Bentley Hart. And he's very much influenced by Eastern theologians. You might be interested to know John Wesley was also influenced by the Eastern theologians. What I'm trying to say is, are there accommodations in the text to empires and so forth? I think one would be on very difficult ground to say no. At the same time, what's interesting to me is how much of the New Testament, for example, how much of the New Testament really is taking on the powers. And I mean, they're principalities and powers in the sense that Paul talks about them and so on. So that you have a church that while the scripture is being developed, it is very much of an alternative community to the Roman Empire. We lose that in the 4th century, and you move into the, move shortly there into the Middle Ages and what some people have called the Dark Ages. By the way, if you want to see a wonderful study of that history, when the Enlightenment came, now the Enlightenment, 17th, 18th century, it's into our own time, it's influential. Great trust in reason and so forth. Also emerges at the same time that the nation state does, which is important. But David Hart really takes on some of the ways that historians have dealt with the church and the way it stifled freedom, etc. And let me tell you, he presents an extraordinarily compelling case that, see, the problem with a guy like Hart, he's actually read the primary sources. So when some of these historians that haven't read them make generalizations about what the church was doing, he goes back into the actual data, into the writings and the rest. And boy, does he kick the rear end of people like Gibbons and some more recent historians. I've been working through that text. It's a little bit to work through, but I just love it. What I'm trying to say, let me say this. Is the Bible a human document? Yes, there's no question about that. Are there places in which it accommodates to the times, the culture, the history in which it exists? Of course. Can one argue that the basic message is therefore, if not destroyed, greatly accommodated? I don't think so. I mean, when you look, for example, at a book like Revelation and the way in which it takes on the Roman Empire, and it really, really does. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And I think the Gospels, certainly can be read in that way. So what am I saying? Are there influences? Of course. Is there an integrity to the text? I think there really is. I think there really is. Cuz?
Let me expand on your question if you wanted to pursue it for fun. There is a YouTube, I think it's YouTube, might be a TED Talk. An historian who was asked to write about, this was within the century, within the last 50 years, write about the King James Version as a part of a celebration. They turned it into about a 1-hour video. And what he does is track how the King James Version was written, why King James had it written, how he had it written. And it was because he was facing a religious civil war at that time, and how he brought the two sides together and gave them a relatively free opportunity to report from the basic documents in a valid way. But don't do anything or write anything that speaks against the crown. And so one example is when they came to Christ, was it Peter? He said, "Upon you I will build my church."
Yes.
There are 3 or 4, if you read 3 or 4 different Bibles today, you'll find 3 or 4 different words in the place of church. And one of them is congregation. And that's the one I like.
Hmm.
He wouldn't let them use congregation because that implied an independent group making their own decisions. I don't want those kind of people reading this book and getting reinforcement. So they use the word church. And of course, at that time, he was the church.
Hmm.
So that's the kind of influence that did.
Hmm. Let me say too,
Get in from time to time. But
Yeah.
as Cuz says, and I'm sure he knows better than me, the integrity is there. That's just an fun video if you'd find it.
Yes,
Tex,
ma'am. Please.
just kind of in response to not to Faith's questions and maybe some of that. I had the opportunity to take church history course
Yeah.
that was taught by Steve Campbell.
Oh my.
And it's one of the best things I think I've ever done at Trinity.
Yeah.
But the thing that I thought was that I hadn't really thought about until I took that class, and what is to me really amazing is that the early Christians, when we think of the Bible, we think of that as being the end all be all. But the early Christians didn't have the Gospels, didn't have they probably had the Old Testament,
Yeah.
but the Gospels hadn't been written then. And so all they had were the stories and the oral traditions.
Mhm.
And yet Christianity survived.
Mhm.
And so, that really helped me
Sure.
in kind of understanding just kind of the mystery, the fact that Christianity survived all those years and carried on. And do I believe the Bible? Some of it, but it is, I don't take it literally in a lot of instances. But I think to me the majesty is the fact that Christianity survived and was passed on initially from one person to the other. And I think some of that gets translated into the Gospels, but I don't know if that helps Faith as far as, I think you have a valid point. When the church decided what was going to be included in the Bible, that there was a lot of give and take on that, let me say. And so I think your question was very valid and very good.
Well,
Mhm.
thank you, Marcia. And just to be clear, I wasn't trying to make a point. That was
Well,
just,
but
it was not a
I think
leading question. I was
I
just,
think you did, though.
no, I'm just interested in the issue. I read a little bit about the Bible in terms of like history.
Mhm.
So I just think that's an interesting issue.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
I had no agenda.
Yeah. It's all right to have one.
Okay. 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 Thank you.
Oh.
The thing that I have found interesting about John, and is it helps me clear up a conundrum that I think we all know, that the word, the Christ, existed way beyond before the birth of Jesus. And that I'm able, I think, now to see this as the birth stories, they're kind of a wake up. Advent's a wake up to remember for our species to remember what is critical to be a human being is to be able to see that the human beings are not, there's something that holds us together besides just a bunch of individuals. And to me, he states that in saying the word was in the beginning.
Mhm. Yeah. I think you're dead right about that.
Did we slip over into question 2?
I don't know that we ever quite distinguished the two.
I think Martha has her hand up.
And yes, please, Martha. Did you not have your hand up, dear? I think she didn't. Avis and Suzanne, you haven't had a comment yet. You got something for us, either of you?
They're muted.
You're muted, Avis.
I unmuted it.
There you go.
I just did. I have to admit that I don't know a whole lot about what we're saying. And I went through at least 2 classes, if you will. One before going overseas and one in college. And I don't know why it's not making sense. But it's fascinating to me. So I must be learning something.
How about you, Suzanne?
No, I got nothing. I'm just here to listen.
Just listening. Okay. All right. Well, we're almost at our time anyhow. In terms of the Gospel of John, let me read you just 2 or 3 very brief comments by people in the history of the church that you might find interesting. Clement of Alexandria, who was 2nd century, he says this, that while other Gospels set forth, quote, physical things, John wrote a spiritual gospel. And Origen, whom I was bragging about, you remember, he's early 3rd century. He called the Gospels the first fruits of all Scripture, and John the first fruits of the gospel. And then I won't do all these, but listen to Martin Luther, 16th century. He wrote that John's gospel is far to be preferred over the other 3 because it will show you Christ and teach you everything you need to know. So a lot of appreciation for John in those comments. Bob, and then I think we'll break.
Thorndike, one of the lead guys in education, talks about a teachable moment. I think that for reasons I don't understand, I found myself in a teachable moment. And your Zoom and my minister's Zoom, for the first time, the term Advent has a real meaning to me. It's never had before. And the studies we've done over these last 4 sessions, as I'm going to use the word magical, has done something magical for me. I can honestly say this year, this will be a time of Christmas is not too, but it's had an emotional and faith restoring experience for me this December that no other December I ever remember having. And so I thank all of you for helping me get into that space and to live there for this month. Thank you.
Yes, and and may it be so for all of us that this will be an advent of the Christ child coming, and and also a signal about that wonderful consummation of all of nature, all of history, and the final aim and end of this wonderful creation. Hey, I wish you all a blessed Christmas.